I agree with you, and I totally understand that. But I mean, from the start though, I mean, I used to really care about the game. Like I wanted the game to be super unique, but after being the only one that really cared about it for a long time, I just kind of didn't really care anymore. And I've kind of viewed it as like this game's gonna make any money to begin with, so I can use this as a stepping stone for something in the future.
I'm sure a lot of you who have clicked on this video had the pleasure of playing Grand Kaisen and have experienced how much of a shitfest it was. The game was unprepared, extremely buggy, and contained barely any content whatsoever. However, I'm not here to discuss how terrible this game was, but rather I'm here to discuss about the extremely shady background of this game, and how some of the parties involved have scammed up towards 250,000 US dollars or even more at this point. Just a quick note before I start discussing this entire thing, a large majority of the context and details of this video is gathered from parties that were directly involved with this entire situation. So allegedly, some of the developers involved with the development of Grand Kaisen have scammed up towards $250,000. And this number isn't just appearing magically, this number comes from a 3-hour podcast hosted on December 23rd, which featured parties that were involved in this situation. I've listened to the entire thing and dissected it to give you guys context on this so that you wouldn't have to listen to a 3-hour yap session. But if you prefer to listen to this entire thing, I will leave a link to it in the description of this video. Now, this podcast features a lot of different parties, so I will give some context as to who some of the parties that appear earlier in this are. Ed or Ederites is an investor who bought a percentage of Grand Kaisen. Sky and Jameer, who are the two hosts of this podcast, are close friends of Ed. Johnny or Do_Big is also an investor who bought out a huge chunk of the game. Pluto is or was one of the co-owners of Grand Kaisen who had a large share in the game. Jovan or Mystified was one of the main owners of the game. A lot of the problems and drama that Grand Kaisen has right now can be traced back to the person named Jovan, who again was the main owner a while back. And the reason can be explained with this clip from the podcast.
Just for a little recap, Jovan initially was the owner of Grand Kaisen, and he actually did not fully own the game. He only had 40% initially. And then what Jovan did, after pretty much scamming other investors on a previous project out of other tens of thousands of dollars, Jovan then decided to take his own liberty and sell 100% of the game, even though he only had 40, to Johnny for 100k USD, if not more. We don't know. And he sold 100%. Johnny, being nice, decided to then only retain 40% and then give 20% to Sean and Pluto, even though since he owned the group, he didn't have to do that. So Jovan really started this whole debacle, and as usual. And then Sean and Pluto were then given 20% each.
So the person who is talking right now, Sky, gives context throughout this podcast around 4 to 5 times. And the lore or the context to this whole thing is basically whatever that was said in this segment of the video. Just for another quick bit of context, Sean is the main owner of the game, and Rev or Ezra or Urza is the main or lead coder for the game. Jovan, Sean, and Pluto used to be the main owners of the game until Jovan decided to scam another party, which is Johnny aka Do_Big, by selling the entire game while he was not the owner of the entire game for 100,000 US dollars. Now of course, Jovan, as being the main owner, held a lot of the primary stuff such as the group the game was being developed on, so he was able to give access to the entire thing to Do_Big. So this is exactly where the first problem arises, but Sky explains that later when Sean and Pluto approached Do_Big with this issue. Sky says that Do_Big was nice enough to give Sean and Pluto their percentages back. So it was good on them, they were able to resolve everything, but this was exactly where everything started to get a little shady. So after this entire debacle, Sean, Pluto, and some of the other devs, including Rev, decided to leave the main game and then make their own game. What they would end up doing is take their own assets from the main game and then bring it over to the sub game to make their own game. However, it is important to note that Dubig was not aware of this, and he was under the impression that everybody else was on board. And this can be seen from this portion of the podcast.
And when they started on this second project secretly, there's already been 120K. No, 115K that was lost. And that was between you and Johnny. So you guys are under the impression, after a total of 115 grand, that the game's being worked on, that Pluto and Sean are on board. But then it started to get shaky and you started to notice some weird things. And you could go into more depth on this. Is the first instance that you realize Sean specifically, was starting to remake the game and using its contents.
So this is where some of the primary issues aside from the Jovan problem started to rise up, and we will get into them one by one. So the first issue came up when Pluto's investors, or the investors who bought shares from Pluto, didn't get their entire investment or didn't get them at all. And in this case, to be more specific, Ed bought 8% of the game from Pluto for 15 grand. And it should make sense that Pluto does not have any affiliation with the shares that he sold because he sold it to another person. But apparently in the context of this situation, Pluto did have an affiliation with those percentages. So at some point, Pluto's shares were lowered because he stepped down from co-ownership and his percentage was renegotiated. And according to Rev, the lead coder for the game, Pluto was informed that the percentages of his investors would be taken, and Pluto apparently agreed to this. However, this makes no sense because Rev later on says that the investors from Pluto's side were never meant to be victims. But this is again pretty contradictory since it was negotiated that the investors' money would be voided.
So what we were going to do is you wanted to step down from the game. You wanted to stop working on it, which was your choice.
Yeah.
And we discussed that if you want to do that, your percent's going to get lowered. However, even though you had already sold like half of your percent and made $20,000 off of it, we said that we were going to tank that percent for your investors, and you would still have it.
Just to clarify another thing, this all exploded after the release of the game. It was basically a ticking time bomb. Nobody was aware that they didn't have their percentages until the game was released. Now, this is only the first argument that was made for the reason why Pluto didn't get his original shares, which seems like a fair argument because he might have gotten his shares in the first place because of his contributions to the game. But him not denying the fact that he was intentionally shafting the investors from this conversation is a little shady. I don't know if it's true or false, but he didn't deny or confirm it, so I guess we won't know because there is no other portion talking about this specific problem in the podcast. But moving away from this first argument, there is a second argument being made which seems to be causing a lot of conflict, and it's basically Rev's entire argument as to why Pluto was cut off from a lot of his percentage, and it's apparently because Pluto was once caught plotting against Rev and Sean, saying that he's gonna steal their percentages and do some other stuff, which is, in my opinion, such a shit argument because in the podcast, Pluto confirms that he had no real access to the game, which, if true, should automatically void the argument made by Rev. Now, of course, Pluto stating something like, "I'm going to steal your shares" to his coworkers is not justified whatsoever. However, if Pluto didn't take any action and had no real way to damage Sean and Rev's argument is automatically complete horse shit. You can't deprive someone of money because of something that they said. This is basically the equivalent of me poking you with a twig and then you turning around and blasting me to oblivion with an RPG. Rev, throughout the entire podcast, really circles around the fact that, ooh, he said this, so I had to take away his percentage. It's a weak argument and it does not justify scamming someone. And by the way, he again openly admits to scamming Pluto because of the things that he said.
As far as Grand Kaisen goes, the shit was not a rug pull. The game got shut down because it was a horrible release. That's what it is. We didn't scam anyone as far as Grand Kaisen goes. It was super rushed. I'll give you all that. I take full accountability for all that. However, when it comes to Pluto and Ederites and all that, Ederites was kind of just like he's caught in the crossfire. There was no intent for Pluto's investors to like get scammed. We said that we were gonna tank that percent for your investors. One thing I will say, and hopefully this just kind of like helps a little bit. Um, to start off with, we didn't intend on scamming them. I already said this. We intend on scamming Pluto. I will say that.
Now, a lot of the stuff in discussion is by technicality not illegal, because a good portion of it was never signed on paper, or even if it was about something else, or it was unrelated to the things in discussion. Now, let's move on to some of Pluto's counter arguments. Pluto argues that some of the assets used in Grand Kaisen was paid by him, and Pluto and Sean apparently split payment on some of the other assets as well. Now, this brings up the biggest issue as well, because if Pluto wanted to, he could pursue legal action because they did pay for some of the assets that are out on the game right now. And by Sean depriving him of revenue from the stuff that he owns or the contributions he made to the game, Sean could be held accountable. And the only counter argument given by Rev throughout the whole podcast was they only used 2 assets that were fully paid by Pluto. And this argument does not make any sense whatsoever, because at the end, the amount stolen doesn't matter. You are still stealing from another person, and you can't really justify it by saying, I only stole this amount and therefore it should be okay. Now, the podcast does mention that a lot of this stuff was solved internally. Rev agreed to give Ed 1% of the game, which Ed had previously owned 8% of, and Pluto doesn't specifically disclose how much he got back, but apparently he was able to resolve something with Sean and Rev. And the fact is, Ed and Pluto still got shafted by a ton. Sean and Rev just gave them pity scraps and called it a day. But there is still an elephant in the room that needs to be addressed, because at least Pluto and Ed got some sort of compensation back, while Dubig, the guy who gave 100k for the game and only kept a fragment of it, is not getting any compensation whatsoever. He straight up got shafted from $100,000. And Rev's argument for this is the fact that he sees Dubig's transaction as, and I quote, illegitimate.
I don't really have too much to say about that as far as Johnny goes. I mean, in my eyes, his deal was illegitimate because Jovan kind of fucked everyone over, and Johnny happened to kind of get fucked over by that himself. But Johnny had nothing to do with the new game that we made whatsoever. All of that was done by me, Sean, and Pluto. And so, while I feel bad for Johnny because he got fucked over by Jovan. I mean, for the new game that we made, we rescripted everything. We have like all new assets. We have a whole different dev team. I mean, at the end of the day, yeah, it sucks that Johnny got fucked over by Jovan, but I personally don't feel like we owe him anything.
Now, I'd like to give you a quick rundown as to how this 250k manifested. Jovan, or Mystified, stole 100k from a previous project, and then stole 100k from Grand Kaisen, which brings up the bill to 200k so far. And then Sean claims to have made 30k from the game, which was essentially scammed from players. I'll get into that in a moment. And another 20k stolen from Pluto and Ed. And this was all of the money that was discussed in the podcast. Now, our next topic is going to be exactly about that 30k that was stolen from the player base. The player base, aka you guys, were expecting a finished project to be released. So essentially, you paid for game passes and you paid for spins and rerolls. But in the end, you got a half-baked game, and in the end, some of you guys got scammed out of your clan rerolls. Let's take a quick look at Rev's argument as to what's going to be done about this.
And especially with how the game was launched, and it was pretty much secretly moved over and done behind their backs. And then you released it, you guys profited off of it, and then you closed it. And do you guys, and this is a more important thing, do you guys intend on paying back any of those players, all of them, reimbursing them for the funds they spent? Because even in this screenshot here, which actually someone had posted here, they said, someone said flexing 10k USD, and then you said 10k USD in half an hour. Yeah. And they said no one is boosting up this game after releases, and then you said no problem, too bad you won't be here for it, I'll miss you. It seems like you had absolutely zero sympathy for the money people had injected into the game. So if you could elaborate more on that.
Yeah, I don't really know what gives you that impression. I have zero sympathy for that. I mean, it's not like
Well, it's comments right there, dude. I mean, it seemed like he didn't really care. It
I
seemed
mean,
like
I was talking to Corgi about that. That had nothing to do with any of the players or what I felt for them. I mean, like I said, it's not even like we permanently shut down the game or anything. Like that's not what happened whatsoever. We shut down the game because it was incredibly buggy, and in the announcement that we shut down the game, we said we planned on re-releasing in the next 1 to 2 days, and we're not like wiping data or anything like that. Like everyone who spent money on the game will still have that stuff. The only thing that happened is some people were in an old server before we wiped data off rip because there was just, like I said, the release was just very rocky. So people that did spend money in those old servers lost it. However, they will all be restored. We have logs for everything. So like I'm not too worried about that.
And this is exactly the final point that I wanted to talk about, which is the fact that these guys just do not care. They already got their money. Do you think they're actually going to restore you? Absolutely not. They did not end up restoring anyone, but instead they said, react to this message, and if it gets to 19k likes, we'll give you 25 clan rerolls. And they say this while also claiming to have the logs to the game, so they claim to have the history of everyone's purchases, and they claim to have all the purchase logs, but yet they refuse to restore anyone and actually give them their money's worth, which is a scam. You cannot just give everyone 25 rerolls and be like, oh yeah, we just restored you guys. And another reason why that I am personally convinced that they're not even gonna bother doing restores is the fact that they just do not care about the player base. Here's a clip from the podcast from Rev, and again, this guy is the lead coder for the game.
But I mean, from the start though, I mean, I used to really care about the game. Like I wanted the game to be super unique, but after being the only one that really cared about it for a long time, I just kind of didn't really care anymore. And I've kind of viewed it as like this game's gonna make me money to begin with, so I can use this as a stepping stone for something in the future. I just want to say that, like I said, I've already said this, but from the beginning, we had no intention of scamming Pluto or the investors. The only reason that this happened is because Pluto went behind our back.
Wait, pause. Wait, hold on. Say the exact line you just said.
I said from the start, we had no intention of scamming Pluto or fucking over his investors from the start. This all happened when Pluto stepped down.
So you scammed him because he went behind your back.
This man views this game as a money printer and as a stepping stone for a future game. And he openly admits to scamming someone because of something that they said, but they say that they just went behind their back by saying that. Apparently, saying something is as bad as doing the same thing. I'm sure that makes so much sense. Now, before I conclude this video, the final thing I'd like to talk about is the screenshots that were provided on the Twitter. The following shows Edorite's plea to get his percentage back for himself and other investors, along with Sean, the main owner, saying, and I quote, "Thanks for the free promo. Made enough today to put your whole family on a plantation." My only input towards this whole entire thing is that you can't really trust anyone. Don't leave anything to chance and put everything on a paper, especially when there's so much money involved. Rev and Sean seem to be extremely immature and unsympathetic towards everything that they have done, and this is clearly shown by their actions. And Jovan, aka Mystified, is the one who kind of lit this fuse up and clearly needs to be put behind bars for his actions. He scammed 200k in total from 2 different people. How is this guy still walking free on the streets? Maybe if Jovan didn't even scam to begin with, we might have had a different Grand Kaisen release, but the reality is laid bare in front of us, and there's not much that can be really done. Moral of the story: make contracts, leave nothing to chance. It's an evil world out there. I hope you enjoyed the video, like and subscribe, and I'll see you in the next one. Peace.